Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in to talk about My Hero Academia chapter 287. It was quite a big chapter. I have like over 7 pages of notes, so it's going to be a long one, probably 40 minutes. So put me on 1.5 times the speed and we'll get into it. Anyway, for this chapter, there was a lot of stuff going on. And, you know, in it, it's really interesting. We actually did end up with a sort of tug of war thing. It was ultimately a battle of emotions and people saying no to Shigaraki. You know, it was pretty interesting having people just stick their hands out and say no. Am I surprised? Well, I wasn't expecting quirky combat. I was expecting to have everyone standing in defiance of All For One. I didn't expect One For All to just pop up so easily next to Nana. I thought he would have been behind everyone else, but they were making a pretty big stand. Again, I'm not surprised that it wasn't quirky combat, because quirky combat doesn't make sense in a mental space. Like Shigaraki decaying All For One, what value is that? We've seen you try to do this before. Like, we already know mental spaces don't react to quirks. Well, you know, not the physical based quirks. Anyway, let me see. Do I have anything else to say for this part here? The big thing, I was sad. I was sad that we didn't get to see the rest of the vestiges, but that point in of itself does lead us to another conclusion that we'll talk about in the video. Anyway, for the structure of the video, what we're going to do first, we're going to talk about the biggest thing, I think, which is the power logic. What exactly is going on with the quirks, and then we will go into the page-by-page walkthrough where there's a lot more topics. There's quite a lot going on in the chapter that's worth talking about. Okay, so trying to make sense of what is going on with the quirks and the quirks in general. So first thing that we have to look at is the premising that All For One gave us. All For One links everything to the quirk factor. Every quirk factor contains a consciousness, the individuality of its wielder, if you will, as he said. So this is already a big issue. What does it mean that quirk factors contain consciousness, and how far does that fact go? Like, what happens to everyone else that can copy quirks like Monoma? Does he have the potential to greet that consciousness? And mind you, I'm only saying potential. Does he have the potential? And what about Toga? Does she have the potential to greet a consciousness like maybe Ochako if she's turned into Ochako? Could Ochako's consciousness scream in her ear or something like that? And what happens when children inherit quirk factors naturally? Are their parents and their ancestors within them? So are we talking about genetic memory in that regard? And mind you, the idea of genetic memory isn't foreign in fiction. So the first question is, when exactly does a consciousness latch to a quirk that's being passed along? And does the mechanism of the passing matter in the consciousness latching? Is it when the original quirk has been stolen, or will a copy be able to create the consciousness passing effect? At this point in time, it's hard to say. Monoma told us that he wasn't able to copy Izuku's stockpile, so that might give us a clue that there's a few more conditions required when it comes to fully copying a quirk, consciousness included. But then we have other troubles, like All Might. All Might doesn't have his own quirk factor. So are we saying that All Might's consciousness got absorbed into the quirk maybe due to the stockpile quirk's effects? Like it got pulled in, like the stockpile quirk is a black hole or something? But then how do we take that and reconcile it with the fact that All Might's vestige isn't fully formed within One For All? Honestly, I think there's more going on here, and the question ultimately comes down to how separate the vestiges are from their origins. Because when I look at All Might, this isn't simply a fragment of consciousness, because I still think the signs point to All Might forming after death. One more point. Viz Media had this panel where they talk about a sleeper car. I had to Google what a sleeper car is. I'm not a fan of colloquialisms in translations, even if it's to try and get a point across, just because like any person who is English as a second language isn't going to understand what they're trying to say when they put that there without thinking to do a Google search to figure out what the colloquialism is. But anyway, according to Wikipedia, a sleeper car is a car that has high performance and an unassuming exterior. So in this context, what All For One is saying is that the quirks, One For All and All For One, at their base, would probably create the interactions that All For One has had in the past, that being the nightmares, and the stockpile quirk seems to have overcharged that capability to its current state. So instead of just fragments and dreams, you get to have vestiges interact with Izuku's physical body. That makes sense if we're using the sleeper car as a metaphor. So what do we take away from all this? Well, the Vestiges gathering was not something that came out due to the stockpile quirk exclusively, but the stockpile quirk might have bolstered that capability. And then in terms of the questions we need to ask at what point does a consciousness transfer over? What are the rules governing All Might's vestige? What level of communication does a vestige have with the source? In other words, can All for One communicate with himself in Shigaraki? And for that one, given that All Might hasn't said anything, the tentative answer seems to be that there's no communication between the vestiges. Next up, we have to ask, where is the stockpile quirk's vestige? There is one thing that the explanation confirms, and that is that all quirks carry some sort of consciousness. So, by that virtue, where is the stockpile quirk's owner? He should be hanging around somewhere in One for All. And mind you, he might be more fragmented, but he should be in there by All for One's logic. And in a similar line of thought, is there an All for One vestige inside of One for All? Now, we've talked about this before, but I think this could go either way right now. And I'd say that it's likelier that there isn't an All for One vestige, but I'll say that with an asterisk. It all depends on the stockpile quirk and its role in all this. Can the stockpile quirk store quirks naturally, or is that a function that only really became possible after mixing with One for All? So I'm not sure if you can see the big picture, but the author could decide this last factor like even 5 chapters before the ending of Hero Academia. And all that would really change is whether or not All for One is inside of One for All. So it's not the most critical detail, but it's definitely one of those details that we would like to know, just to know where exactly we want to know the boundaries of the capabilities of every quirk. All that said though, at this stage, there is one pretty big and clear conclusion that you should have when you have All for One talking about his time with the Doctor. All for One knew 100% that he was going to have a fragmented version of himself inside of Shigaraki. He knew he was going to be inside of Shigaraki. That wasn't a surprise to him. So, keeping that in mind, think very carefully about what exactly All for One's endgame might be here, given that he knew that he would still be living on in Shigaraki. Now, all that said, I still think there are things that All for One doesn't know. Given what All for One is saying in this chapter even, I find that it's likely that All for One doesn't have the full picture. I'm 100% sure that the author still has some tricks up his sleeves when it comes to how these two quirks are working. And I'm sure that the author is going to pull out the unreliable narrator card in the future to justify those developments. And you can ask like, well, why would we say that? Well, because the author already has a history of using unreliable narrators for certain plot points. For instance, All Might talking about how the vestiges aren't all that important, and Izuku whenever he over-dramatizes some event that's about to happen in Hero Academia. And in this case, all the author would need to do is say that there was a more spiritual, paranormal aspect to the whole situation that All for One and the Doctor just couldn't see because they're men of science. That's really all the author has to do to make that work. Anyway, that is the first part of the video. That was the talk about the quirks. Let's get into the page-by-page walkthrough. So page 1 is an establishment page with Nana making a commentary. At this point, my question is, does Nana actually know how she died? Again, knowing the degree of communication between the vestige and the origin would be valuable, but what can we do? If the vestiges are actually just flat out dead souls, the information carrying over to the vestige after the origin dies, that would be fine, you can make that work. Alternatively, knowing that One for All has some kind of weird time delay such that Izuku and Bakugo could both have One for All at the same time during the climax of the second movie, when you keep that in mind, there's another mechanism to justify how a vestige can know events after it's been passed over to someone else. Regardless, when I read Nana's line here, it suggests that there's some sense of continuity of consciousness between the origin and the vestige. But we have to wait and see for this one. Also, just want to say, Nana has really muscular legs. Like, oh my god, man. Crap, she could crush someone. Page 2, biggest thing of value is characterizing All for One for the chapter. The second biggest thing is noting the direction that the wind is going. That just says that All for One began the absorption process. It was a cool effect, I think. Page 3, All for One begins premising this whole thing, citing the oddities of transplant patients. So just for the record, in our world, this is considered pseudoscience, because the level of research conducted on it hasn't been up to standard. It's been pretty poor. That said, that idea is pretty great for fiction. So just know when All for One says that there's plenty of supporting evidence, for our world, it's anecdotal evidence, and it requires a bit more application of rigorous scientific process. Me personally, I would love the idea of cellular memory to actually be a thing, even if it only affects 10% of the population. I think it would be cool. but for now, it's something that just lives on in fiction. Okay, so we already analyzed the page for the first part, but I want to draw your attention to this panel. These episodes often leave me discouraged. Am I really capable of feeling guilt for my sins like some utterly ordinary person? Okay, so that's a big red flag. That just says All For One is a narcissist, like a hardcore one, and maybe a little bit of a god complex, but note his manner of speech. For the whole panel, he calls his dream odd, devaluing them to the point of a curiosity. He says they hurl abuse his way, painting himself as the victim. He mentions being discouraged as if he's some kind of ordinary person. And he acknowledges that he does bad, but he questions if he should care. All For One continues being the flowery type of person that hides atrocities behind flowery language. What this should ultimately just remind you is that you shouldn't take All For One seriously when he's speaking in niceties. Everything this guy does is to serve his own purposes. He is a hardcore manipulator. Don't let his kindness take you for a ride. Page 4, what I wanted to draw your attention to is the bottom panel. It seems like Shigaraki was going to question why Nana was in his head earlier. At the time of this panel, a lot of people were saying Nana was inside of Shigaraki actually. And at that time I said like, nah man, like that Nana was more likely to be a figment or a manifestation of Shigaraki's resistance to All For One. So does anything change here with this new bit of information? Well, sort of. On page 5, Nana acknowledges that Shigaraki is Kotaro's son. So I don't think she would be doing that if she was actually inside of Shigaraki, because there would be no need for that particular acknowledgement, because you already know. But there are some other implications that we have to keep in mind. The vestiges aren't disembodied spirit. They're locked to the vessels, given that All For One speaks of seeing through Shigaraki's eyes. But when you couple that with the fact that we don't know whether or not communication is occurring, if you want to say that there's a Nana inside of Shigaraki, you could say that it's another separate Nana vestige. And then just say that they can't communicate, and you could have a pretty justified method there. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that thought, but the author is already using cellular memory, so all he needs to do is just jump across the lane and just inherit genetic memory into the story as well. He's already implemented one field of pseudoscience, so it wouldn't be that hard to just implement another. There is one thing that's really concerning here though. Nana in chapter 286 and Nana in Shigaraki's vision trip, they seem to both like holding boys' heads. So that's a behavioral quirk, which makes things a little bit weirder when you think about the fact that that's a common behavior between what we're saying is a figment and what's actually a vestige. Do you see why that's a little bit concerning? That by itself lends a lot more thought to there being a Nana vestige inside Shigaraki, but then we have to deal with the mechanism by which it got inherited. Page 5, I want to show you the face of a deluded man-child that mistakes gifts from other people for his own efforts. Only Shigaraki could think to curse his grandmother while he's being mind raped. Like really, only Shigaraki could compromise on himself at such a high rate. And honestly, at some points, Shigaraki's just asking for All For One to take advantage of him. Even now, the guy only speaks for a long period of time when All For One lets him. Page 6, nothing too important other than the K lines showing up in the space. Page 7 though is really good because oh man, this is ridiculous. So as you guys recall, one of my big questions was why? Why did the Doctor and All For One believe Shigaraki would be the one to solve this problem of being unable to take One For All? What was so special about Shigaraki? Maybe he had a weird quirk in him or something. But nah. Now let's just make sure we talk about that. It's possible that there's still more to it. But what All For One is giving us right now is very ridiculous. So All For One's plan hinges on Shigaraki being capable of the world's biggest temper tantrum. Maybe Shigaraki could do that. Shigaraki's pretty maladjusted, honestly. But is he serious? Is rage the factor in this battle of wills? I have to question, did these guys ever consider that 8 people's worth of anger and regret in one boy's body? Did they consider that as a factor? All Might's rage, the same one that he criticized in this chapter, terrified him, and he thinks Shigaraki alone would be enough to overcome that because he's angry. Now mind you, this isn't stupid writing. This is just All For One and a Doctor maybe having a round of hubris. They're getting a little bit too overconfident. This might also just lend more oomph to the idea that the two they don't have a full idea of what they're doing when it comes to One For All. And especially when you consider what the brother is pointing out to All For One later. All For One definitely has tunnel vision. Anyway, I really expected something better than make Shigaraki angry enough. Like, oh, jeez. One of the birds is angry. Anyway, there's other good things here, like Shigaraki trying to douse All For One. I do appreciate how much of a troll All For One is, though, throughout all of this. Even though I think this part's a little bit stupid on his part. Page 8, a beautiful shot of One For All. I can't wait for Shigaraki to try again at some point in the future, only to have All Might show up and stick his hand out as well and deny him. I think that'll be pretty funny too. Page 9, One For All says that they want to stay with Izuku. So this justifies something from the second movie, which is cool, and it confirms to us that these guys have a little more power than we thought when it comes to whether or not they leave when you show them to the door. So also in terms of imagery, this image looks pretty messianic, like especially with how the light erupts from behind One For All, really makes him feel like he's a savior kind of thing. The author does seem to want to tell viewers that the brother is ultimately good, which is important for our follow-up point. Page 10, another important page for this. First, this hand, this is the first time All For One showed it. That's why it has those web-like trails coming from its fingers. He just manifested it out of Shigaraki's body. So in other words, the guy probably just gained a bit more influence over Shigaraki's body. Then we have this panel. Combine your strength with my own and we can steal them away. So very interesting again that we have a separation, a distinction between All For One and Shigaraki's pool of power. It just does tell you that the All For One quirk hasn't fully given itself over to Shigaraki, which All For One does later confirm, but it's a little bit concerning that a vestige has this much control and this much untapped power still. Finally, this panel is important because it shows One For All slightly being pulled in, and also the dialogue just shows All For One's limits. For instance, right now, it seems he can only see through Shigaraki, and second, it sets him up for having an egocentric judgment. In other words, All For One can only see the world in his own terms. Sorry, just realized that it got darker here. Anyway, having that kind of tunnel vision is what allows One For All to rebut him. And this is important to keep in mind because it's moments like this that make it more likely that All For One isn't seeing the whole picture here. For instance, a good example of not seeing the whole picture is him underestimating the grudges that a bunch of dead people might have, especially in this arena where emotions play a role. Next, page 11, the All For One rags on Izuku page. Now, listen, man, I'm all for ragging on Izuku. Before there was Dabi, there was Izuku, who was my favorite punching bag. But if you're going to be doing that, you have to do it the right way, and All For One does not do it the right way. All For One's points just reflect his own values. On Izuku being unable to protect, factual, but that situation developed because no one was able to stop Shigaraki before Izuku got involved. So I can't fault people for being outmatched from the beginning. I think the heroes on this side did a good job. They were doing their best. Everyone here has been doing their best. So I can't fault them for that. And Izuku ultimately moved to protect people. At the end of the day, Izuku's actions prevented Shigaraki from reaching the powerless people, i.e. the civilians that they were trying to evacuate. Next, All For One criticizes Izuku's rage, which the brother gave a really great defense for. But what you need to zero in on here is the hypocrisy. He criticizes rage, but his entire plan revolves around rage. He understands rage is powerful for his own purposes, but he makes fun of the rage of the other person involved in the tug of war. Do you see the discontinuity in the thought there? Now, like, this is All For One being kind of a troll, but he's also being blinded by tunnel vision. Honestly, that rage that Izuku has is probably going to come in really clutch for Izuku, because in Hero Academia, anger is painted as a good thing if Izuku's pointing it in the right direction. Banjo is the one that established that, and these people continue establishing that rage is worthwhile. So maybe worth keeping that in mind. But one thing that I really come out of this feeling is that I would love to see All For One as Izuku's father after this, just to see how Izuku reacts to knowing that his father thinks he's worthless, because I think that would be really valuable. But honestly, nah, we could do without All For One being the father. Page 12-13, the most important pages in the chapter, hand down. There's so much going on here. So first, let's talk about the biggest thing that stood out to me, because I've been a proponent of this for a very long time. Izuku is going to save Shigaraki. I think this is it. I think once the dust has settled, Izuku is going to tell his closest friends that he wants to save Shigaraki. As you all know, I'm a fan of that idea because that's something that I think is fit for a great hero. I feel like Izuku being able to say that he wants to save Shigaraki is what would elevate him to being a great hero. But if you need to know why, it's because of the juxtaposition of this panel. In the same panel where One For All says that Izuku rages for the sake of others, you have Izuku seeing Shigaraki suffering, and don't tell me this is in the face of suffering. Man, look, Izuku's gonna tell someone that he wants to save Shigaraki after this is over. Maybe he'll be looking at his arm, maybe he'll be in the hospital bandaged up. He's gonna be telling someone like, hey, I think I want to save Shigaraki. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be a great moment. If it doesn't happen, I'll take my hit, but I think it's more likely to happen, especially in Shonen where, what was the guy's name? Toby? Yeah, Toby got to be the MVP of Naruto, right? So if you have that going on, I'm sure we've seen worse redemption. And on that point, can we say there will be an aftermath? Well, actually yes, because of the 6 stars that the author drew behind Izuku. In other words, the 6 missing users that would have been lovely to have seen here, author. So with this, the author has drawn a ridiculously long line in the sand. In doing this and choosing to keep these characters out, what the author has essentially done is he's reserving their big entrances. What you should see here is that there's most likely going to be 5 big moments for the other users, 1 for each. Maybe 4 if the author slaps 2 of the previous holders together for their big moment. And why does that make sense? Well, because this was Nana's big moment. Banjo has gotten a big moment. Nana's big moment wasn't removed by the reveal of a brand new design. And I don't count One For All because we've known about One For All for a while. But yeah, he's preserving big moments for the characters. So when you take that into account and you apply the Shonen Jump escalation formula, what it says is that there should be at least 4 to 5 more crisis points for these users to come out in a really big, impactful way. That means at least 4 more Izuku-centric arcs. The author making the choice to not show them now is probably because he has more plans for these characters. And for me personally, I do think that one of the moments is going to be Izuku talking with the All Might Vestige after All Might dies. Or maybe talking with the Vestige at a critical moment when he has no one else to talk to. Honestly, I would love for All Might to live and never die. But that All Might Vestige is a sign of narrative doom for All Might. Now, final point, All For One says that they're going to follow Izuku. Now, the reason that's important is because of the discussions of whether or not One For All is provoking or influencing Izuku. And also because it furthers the talk about the nature of the curse of One For All. Right now, it seems like Izuku's choices aren't being provoked by One For All. If anything, it looks like One For All is actually being perplexed by Izuku and is being carried away by Izuku given what he's saying in this panel. What that leads me to think is that right now, Izuku is being cursed by his own sense of duty and responsibility. The odds of the author subverting this, they're kind of lessened right now. But that, of course, does bring up other points, like what happened to the 4th user. Did he just burn himself out from using One For All too much? Did he have a strange background? Or does One For All have a strange involuntary backlash where the trauma of the other users comes back into your mind and ruins you? Or is it something having to do with the way a user dies when One For All leaves their body? Like maybe after One For All has fully left their body, it takes everything with it, including their vitality, so they slowly start dying. And maybe like they're dead within a year or something like that. That would be reasonable, but ultimately to find that out, we need to talk to either All Might or the 4th user. And considering that All Might is horrible at communication, we're pretty much stuck with the dead man. We have to talk to a dead man. We have to hope that we can talk to the dead man as opposed to the teacher. Because again, All Might is horrible at communication. It's really unfortunate. Right now, what we should take away from this is that it's less likely that One For All is pushing Izuku forward, and it's more likely that there's some kind of hidden nature to how the power works that is causing a negative effect such that All Might doesn't feel comfortable talking about it. So it's a slightly different thing. It's a slight nuance there. Page 14, we're back in the real world, and it seemed that there was a violent rejection between the two of these smudges on the first panel or any indication. Anyway, we get a shot of the two. Pretty interesting that the regeneration quirk regenerates the hair to be the current length that it was at. I do legitimately wonder how that quirk monitors dead cells. On page 15, we get something I was hoping for, as you recall. All For One signaling the retreat. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. At the end of the day, All For One, he is the guy with the pants in the relationship. Now, I think all we need to do is see how Shigaraki is going to run. Honestly, for this, all For One needs to do is hijack Shigaraki's mouth and just tell Higanto to run the moment that Shigaraki sees Higanto. And on that note, really great that we get to see Higanto's side on this chapter. So we go into page 16. We're greeted with Dobby's happy face. He's really happy. He's really ready to tear down the fake hero society. Now, I'm not going to say anything bad about Dobby. Why? Well, because this is actually pretty in character for Dobby, him being excited to see mayhem. Like, yeah, this checks out. This is pretty consistent. It's nice that the guy has a firm identity. The person that deserves scrutiny here, though, is Toga. So first off, I saw people saying Ochako versus Toga rematch, but honestly, I don't see them having a proper fight. I don't think the logistics will allow it to happen properly here. Like, there's too much going on, and Toga right now seems to be on a self-discovery bend. But that brings us to the main point. Toga right now is like a child that realizes there's a consequence to her actions. The author showing the destruction of the buildings as Toga speaks is not a coincidence. He's showing you how audacious Toga's words are right now, that this girl is questioning why people might kill them when they are quite literally destroying society. Think about how crazy that is, but that just speaks to how unaware Toga is. Like, the villains are very much just unaware children in some regards. It depends on the villain. Like, Mr. Compress is not an unaware child. That his characterization is not going that direction. Anyway, what's important to remember here is that we know what led to Twice being slaughtered by Hawks. It wasn't because Twice wasn't considered a person. In fact, ironically, you could say he was killed because he was considered a person. No, Twice died because of the intersection of three factors: Twice's heart, the circumstances of Twice's potential, and Hawks' own weakness. Look, here's how this goes. Whether a hero will be able to save a villain is entirely predicated on how strong the hero in question is. For instance, say a villain has 3 people held hostage at gunpoint, and the hero for the situation is some significant amount of meters away, such that it would take him like maybe 30 seconds to run up to the villain to neutralize the villain. The villain has decided to fire. What does the hero do in that situation? Well, let's say that they have a quirk that lets them neutralize the villain quickly, but that quirk has a pretty high fatality rate if the skill isn't up to par. Is it reasonable for the hero to not take the shot? Now, that's just an example, but it wouldn't be hard to create multiple situations where you put a hero in a tough spot. And also, let's just remember, by Fat Gum's own metrics for success, Hawks already failed. At the end of the day, it was a bad situation, but the alternative was letting Twice go free to potentially create some post-villain fight Shigarakis, and if those had been created, that would have been a really giant disaster for everyone else at the other side. So, back to Toga. If Toga is about to kill multiple people the way she has been doing before, not even counting the hundreds of people who are quite literally screaming and crying below her feet right now as Giganto squishes them, she should not be surprised if a weak hero, and when I say weak, I mean a hero that doesn't have as many options to neutralize a threat. Anyway, she shouldn't be surprised if a weak hero like that has to make a choice to protect people from a known serial killer. And honestly, the author has to try and make Toga sympathetic because that's how he creates the conflict. But this is a really insane thought to have in general. If in the real world, a known serial killer who is responsible and is linked to many murders of many people was gunned down while committing actual homicide in the process, in the real world, people in the real world wouldn't blink twice. Especially if they're a prolific serial killer. Heck man, you throw in some child victims and even more people are going to be behind it. Now there is something within Toga's obliviousness to what she's doing. Toga acknowledged heroes save people and then brought up Jin. So it sounds like Toga wants the heroes to save them. I think what's going on here is that Toga is gripping with the possibility that no one's going to come to save her. But you know, when you consider that, there's something that makes this even more tone deaf on Toga's part. And it's specifically the hero that captured her and Mr. Compress. You remember this guy. This guy tried to capture her. He was even sympathetic. But how did the villains respond? How did Twice respond? He whacked him over the head and didn't stop. So this is the problem. The hero that showed Toga and Compress nuance and mercy had his brains bashed in. And Toga is conveniently forgetting that interaction. I mean, if that guy stood back up, would you fault that guy for neutralizing all 3 of them right there if he could stand back up? No, not really. So what you have to recall here is that mercy is only afforded by the strong and the foolish. And that's what really should be remembered, because that's what we're seeing in Hero Academia. Now that brings us back to our central... I think it's really funny. that interaction is being ignored by Toga, because that interaction shows the exact reasons why things are so difficult with villains. Now that brings us to our central pals. obviously both of them are idealistic and both of them have not had to make hard choices yet. And in that sense, they're going to be more prone to wanting to save Toga. Both of them are people that want to save people. The question ultimately is, how hard is Toga going to make it for them? So ultimately, as we're going into this, how is this going to work? If I was to say, Toga's probably going to jump off of Giganto at some point and go to see Ochako. And at that point, Toga's probably going to show... And at that point, I feel like Ochako is going to show Toga that she doesn't want Toga to die. And maybe after that, who knows, maybe that shakes Toga a little bit. Maybe Toga leaves the battlefield and this puts her squarely in the I want to save Shigaraki camp. And this leads into Toga eventually being an ally when it comes to saving Shigaraki from All For One. I don't know. It could happen. Again, I think the big thing to take away from this is that the people that Toga just chose to like pretty much base her entire life philosophy on are both of the people that are the super idealistic ones in the series. They're not going to want to kill Toga if they can help it, partly because they haven't had to make these hard choices yet. And you know, that's going to be really interesting. But what I'm going to be looking forward to in the future is going to be seeing what kind of energy that scene's going to have. It's just because like, this is going to be a really awkward situation, because Giganto's not going to stop and wait unless the heroes who are there put up a giant wall against him. But who do you have? Who do you have that can actually put up a giant wall against Giganto? No one. You lost the guy that was actually making walls. So it's going to be interesting to see how that's going to unfold. Anyway, everyone, we're at 40 minutes. That was a long video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought down below. I think I gave you guys a lot of good points for this chapter, so let me know what you thought. And until next time, I hope you have an absolutely great day. I gotta go edit the video now.